Hi, I'm Jim Zogby and welcome to Viewpoint. Israeli internal politics are in the midst of a political shakeup with the announcement that hardliner Avigdor Lieberman will replace Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon, who has had several public differences recently with Benjamin Netanyahu. Joining me with his analysis of the situation is Nathan Guttman. He's the Washington Bureau Chief and Staff Writer for The Forward, former Washington correspondent for the Israeli dailies The Haaretz and Jerusalem Post. Thanks for joining us, Nathan.
Thanks for having me.
I want to sort of play this out as we saw it play out, because there have been a number of press reports. I've been following the Israeli press on it, and I've read conspiracy theories as wild as anything I've ever seen in the Arab papers. I mean, it was just, you know, this was engineered by the Gulf states and Egypt, and it was engineered by the United States. But as we see the scenario having played out, it looked like Netanyahu not only wanted to expand his coalition, but he wanted to get rid of his defense minister. That's what precipitated it. And if I could, I just want to play out a few of the things. There was this horrific killing of the medic shooting a Palestinian in the streets who was down.
A soldier.
Yeah. Killing a young man who was accused of attacking Israelis and shooting him in cold blood. The deputy minister of defense, the deputy chief of staff rather, issued a very strong statement on Israel Independence Day that was quite striking, actually, for its emotive content. I mean, anytime you refer to the Holocaust is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, he actually made it on the Holocaust Memorial Day.
On Holocaust Memorial Day, yes. not Independence Day. Let's look at the statement that he made. It was really quite, I thought, quite telling. If there's anything that frightens me about the Holocaust, he says, remembrance, it's the recognition of the horrifying processes that took place in Europe in general and in Germany in particular back then, 70, 80, 90 years ago, seeing evidence of them here today among us in the year 2016. Netanyahu immediately attacked it. And the defense minister defended him.
Right.
At that point, coupled with a few other things, Benjamin Netanyahu felt he had. Is that probably the scenario that you think played out, that he wanted to get rid of Ya'alon, or was there more to it than that?
That was a main factor, definitely. He wanted to get rid of Ya'alon because of this, because of the deputy chief of staff issue, because of the fact that while Ya'alon was backing the military as it investigated and arrested the soldier who shot the wounded Palestinian, Netanyahu actually phoned the parents of that soldier to support them. And clearly there was friction on this base. And not only friction, Netanyahu himself feels under pressure from his right flank in the government, his partners there in his own Likud party. So definitely Ya'alon was becoming a problem. And therefore it made political sense for him to get rid of Ya'alon. And he coupled that with a move that would broaden his coalition, because this current Netanyahu government was based until last week on only 61 members of the Knesset, which is out of 120. It's a one-member majority, which means that it's very shaky. If anyone would leave under any circumstances, the government would fall. And therefore, Netanyahu felt the need to broaden his coalition. So this is how he got both goals. He also removed Ya'alon from his position and also managed to establish a more stable coalition with 66 members.
But he spent weeks in what were supposed to be private negotiations with the Zionist Union, which is the center-left, if you will, coalition, spearheaded by Labor, Isaac Herzog. And then private, but very public. Everybody knew what was going on. And then does this very quick about-face and moves toward Lieberman. What precipitated that shift? Was it a feint to the left? Or was it a serious breakdown in the talks with the left, or was there no intention to do it at all in the first place?
I think most people that look at it now, in retrospect, understand that basically Netanyahu was playing Herzog for a fool. He used Herzog to actually somehow invite Lieberman and the right wing into the coalition. There was this veiled threat out there that, look, I'm going to have Herzog and the Labour, the Zionist Union, join me in my coalition. We're going to break to the center. There's this Arab Peace Initiative. Tony Blair is trying to promote some kind of a international political move that will advance a two-state solution. All this was on the table in the negotiations with Herzog, but basically Netanyahu never wanted to close a deal. What he wanted was to somehow urge Lieberman to come in. And that's how he lowered Lieberman's price. Basically, he urged Lieberman to come in and save the right-wing policy from a break to the center, which would happen if he would ever actually bring in Herzog to the coalition.
So when I refer to Netanyahu as a maneuverer, I'm not far off.
No, and it's surprising because when he started off his career, he was actually known as a not so successful politician. I mean, people knew that he could get elected, but he could never figure out the factions. And now, in the past 3 or 4 years, basically Netanyahu not only has political power, but he also knows how to maneuver the coalition, and he knows how to maneuver the Israeli electorate. And in that sense, he was very successful. He went on this move which managed to weaken his main rival, which is Bougie Herzog and the Zionist Union, because now they just seem clueless.
They're in disarray.
Right, and there's going to be some kind of re-election inside there, and they're probably going to kick out Herzog sooner or later. So he did that, and he brought into his coalition by expanding it to the right. Speaking
about, as I was referring to earlier, about conspiracy theories, there was this initiative announced by Sisi in Egypt to convene a regional peace conference, which Herzog immediately supported, and Netanyahu almost as immediately supported, using the same language. And the suspicion was that the three of them, Herzog, Netanyahu, and al-Sisi, were in an orchestrated move to pave the way for this new right, center-left government. And the very next day, he ends the negotiations and invites Lieberman in, getting Sisi quite upset.
Right, and rightly so, because it turned out that Sisi was actually playing a part in the internal Israeli political maneuver here.
So you think there was an engineering of a effort?
It seems to, based on the reports, that there was, and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was also involved in that behind the scenes, trying to get this. Because basically, the only way to get Labour and Herzog into the government is by providing them some kind of a horizon for a peace process. And Bibi Netanyahu obviously doesn't want to and doesn't have the coalition to do that. But if the Egyptian leader comes with a plan, that could either lead to something or lead to nothing, like any other peace process, but it would provide Herzog with the excuse of going into the government. He would be seen as the leader who managed to shift Netanyahu to the center and reignite peace talks. It would be a certain success on his behalf. But basically at the end, and again, looking at it at retrospect, Sisi was playing a role that I don't think he meant to play starting off.
Now, in all honesty, right, Yalon is not my cup of tea. But he, on the right, and even among elements in the center, and certainly in the military, he's a respected figure. And he's gone.
Right.
He's gone. And he did not leave quietly. He gave a pretty tough talk as he stepped down, and I want to just put up a quote from what he said, and then follow it with a quote from Ehud Barak. And the quote is, "Extremist and dangerous elements have overrun Israel as well as the Likud party, shaking up our home and threatening those harm to those in it." And then followed by the quote by Ehud Barak that says, "Israel has been infected by the seeds of fascism. What has happened is a hostile takeover of the Israeli government by dangerous elements, and it's just the beginning. The government needs to be brought down before it brings all of us down. There are no serious leaders left in the world who believe in the Israeli government." That's pretty tough talk.
Right, and of course we should keep in mind that Ehud Barak represents a different political ideology and political party, but Yalon comes within, from inside the Likud, and was considered one of the most respected leaders in the Likud, and in no way is he a moderate. His views could be considered hardliner in terms of the way.
Well, he got in trouble with the U.S. a couple of times over really outrageous comments he made about Secretary Kerry and about President Obama.
Right, and he definitely supports settlements in the West Bank and so on. But he is perceived as a decent person, as a man who understands that even though Israel is in this complicated situation, you still need to stick to some kind of a moral compass, and that in that sense, it's important for him to be that moral compass. And he got the sense that Netanyahu was losing it, and therefore. Once he did that, of course, he lost the support of his own party.
I wanted to get to the next quote, which is not from a leftist. It's from Moshe Arens, who is a leader in the Likud.
And also a former defense minister.
A former defense minister himself, and he says, Yalon's ouster is likely to be a turning point in Israel's political history. A political earthquake is in the offing. It may take a little time, but it's coming. A law of unforeseen consequences is at work. What is he referring to? Is it the same kind of almost Armageddon scenario that Ehud Barak is talking about, or is it something less than that?
I think it's more this kind of a wishful thinking that's going on in Israel's moderate right wing. People like Moshe Arens or Moshe Ya'alon, who belong to the old Likud, what the Likud used to be once, which was, again, going back to the question of decency, of mainstream to a certain extent, supporting the idea of greater Israel, but understanding that you also have a role to play in the world. And basically what Arens was referring to is this notion that after what happened, after the way that Ya'alon was kicked out of the defense ministry, and the way that Avigdor Lieberman was brought into the coalition, basically the Likud has shifted so far to the right that there's a void now in the Israeli political spectrum for a new type of Likud, for restarting what used to be the Likud, a moderate right-wing party with people like Ya'alon in its leadership, or others that are mentioned, like Gideon Sa'ar, for example, who was also basically kicked out by Netanyahu. And I think that's the talk that many people have, but I'm not sure that there's really the electorate for that kind of a new party in Israel right now.
So Ya'alon is replaced by Lieberman, who just 2 years ago, when Lieberman criticized Netanyahu's Gaza war, Netanyahu said some very unpleasant things about Lieberman, never saw a war, has no experience with war, can't even sit through a whole cabinet meeting. And told him basically how to keep his mouth shut. Now he appoints him defense minister.
Oh, that's the lovely thing about politics. You can do anything you want. Yeah.
But it follows it by saying, to those who question whether or not Lieberman is qualified, he says, "Don't worry about it. I'm in charge," which has caused now some people in Israel to worry about the fact that you've got sitting at the top of this government a prime minister who basically does not respect his own cabinet, does not see them playing a role, even though the cabinet is supposed to be the decision-making, doesn't even see a security cabinet as being decisive, and manipulates and moves the chess pieces around to satisfy himself. Is there, if I can shift for a moment, is there a similarity between Netanyahu in Israel and Erdogan in Turkey? I mean, is there a danger of a consolidation of so much power in the one man that Israeli democracy is, such as it is now compromised seriously?
I'm not sure it has reached that point yet of a threat to the democracy, but we should keep in mind that Netanyahu has emerged as one of the strongest leaders that Israel has ever seen. He's in power for more than 10 years. He's actually the second longest serving prime minister in Israel after Ben Gurion. He has endless political power right now. And in that context, it's interesting to see this battle that he had now with the military, because basically in this bizarre world now, the military is in charge of maintaining the democracy, and the elected government is seen as the side that's infringing on democracy in Israel. So definitely he has immense political power. I don't think he's trying or he intends to abuse it in the sense of overturning the Israeli democracy. Clearly, he's committed to democracy. But politically, he's as strong as ever.
Lieberman has a very unusual past. Things he said have been quite outrageous. And then he acts as foreign minister, and in the beginning, governments wouldn't speak with him. But he was able to moderate his tone sufficiently enough so that the U.S. actually began to deal with him. Defense minister, there's a huge aid package being negotiated here in the U.S. Does it affect it? Does Lieberman become a wild card or a pragmatist? Or is he simply sitting in a seat Netanyahu gave him because Netanyahu wanted somebody else out, and we're not going to see much in the way of decision-making coming from Lieberman's office?
Well, a few things. First of all, the position of defense minister in Israel is the most important cabinet position after the prime minister. Mm-hmm. This is a country that has been involved in many wars, and basically this is a person who is, in a sense, the commander-in-chief, who does send people to war in the way the Israeli system is built. Not only that, of course, he manages a huge bureaucracy with billions and billions of dollars. So that is a very significant position. It's also very significant politically for a person like Avigdor Lieberman, because if he is thinking of challenging Netanyahu one day and of running for prime minister himself, he needs the security credentials, and he doesn't have that yet. And after serving as defense minister, he could definitely gain these security credentials. He could definitely come in 2 or 3 or 5 years and tell the Israeli voters, listen, I have the experience. I ran the Israeli military. You can trust me. And that is a very important political standpoint for him. And
will the military respect him?
The military is very organized, and they respect the person that leads the system, definitely. However, throughout the years, most of the defense ministers came from within the military establishment. There were former generals, chiefs of staff, like Ehud Barak or Moshe Ya'alon, or had military experience. Very few of them were pure civilians. Arens is one of them. But then there was this recent experience with Amir Peretz from the Labour Party, who was considered a failure as defense minister, and many people attributed that to the fact that he didn't come from within the ranks of the military. So yes, the military will abide and respect, but still there is this gap. They would rather see someone from within. The Israeli system is built in the way that many times you'll see people that went through all the course of the military and then become the top civilian leader of the system.
Just for listeners' sake, there were negotiations even after the announcement was made that Netanyahu was going to turn to Lieberman and his party. There were negotiations that had to take place, demands that Lieberman had, and demands that other coalition partners had, terms that had to be set. You want to just go through a little of that, the pension plan issue, the issue of the ultra-Orthodox, issues that had divided that are now being reconciled in this. Talk a little about that, what it took to make this coalition happen.
Right, but basically Lieberman gave up on many of these issues. Because we should also remember, it's not only Lieberman, it's a party, and it's basically, at least his party started off as a Russian immigrant party. And that's why the issue of pensions was important for him. These are talking about pensions of Russians who immigrated to Israel in the 1990s, and there's this gap in the pensions that they get.
This is
his core constituency.
A detour for a minute. Yeah. I've polled in Israel a number of times, and what's fascinating to me, from the earliest polling that we did in the 90s, we had to poll in 3 separate languages. You had to do Arabic polling, and you had to do Hebrew polling, and Russian polling. Right. And candidates back then, when they ran for office, would do ads on Russian television because the 1 million or so Russian Israelis would not understand Hebrew television. That's changed somewhat, but there still is a distinct Russian flavor to the party and to the leadership. Talk a little, the pension plan is part of it because they haven't served in the military.
Right, of course, and that's why they want to basically get equal rights to the Israelis that were born and lived in Israel and served in the military and so on. But not only that, there are other issues that are specific to this sector that Lieberman represents, and one of them has to do with the relationship with the ultra-Orthodox parties. Many of these Russian immigrants came from a very secular background, from mixed married Jewish-Christian families, and they're having huge problems with the Israeli religious system, which is based on the Jewish Orthodox denomination. That was a source of contention between Lieberman and the religious parties. He also had to give up on that on a few issues. So these go back to, we tend to think of Lieberman as a right-wing hardliner. That's true, but he's also a representative of a certain constituency that still exists in Israel, even though many of them are already second-generation Israelis.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift for a moment to Herzog, who came out with a blistering statement about Netanyahu, was scoffed at by his own party, saying, "Stop pretending to be the opposition. We know you're not." His fate?
Pretty gloom, I'd say. The Labour Party, or the Zionist Union, or Zionist Camp as it's called now, is usually not that forgiving with leaders that try and fail. And let's just remember, for the past 3 or 4 decades, most Labour leaders failed. I mean, since Yitzhak Rabin, there hasn't been really a long-standing Labour leadership in Israel. So this is a party that takes revenge at the leaders that fail it. And it's likely that Herzog will be challenged, whether by Sheli Yachimovich, who used to be the head of the party, someone else who will come from inside the party ranks. But frankly, that's not their main problem. The main problem is, if you look at the recent polls, they're no longer the second party, not even the third party in size. They're shrinking all the time. Their supporters are leaving them either to a centrist secular party such as Yair Lapid's, or a few of them to the left, to Meretz, or whatever is left from the left.
Which brings me to the issue of the Israel of the 60s and 70s. The 50s, 60s, and 70s was Labor-led.
Right.
There was a kind of even split with Likud as you moved into the 70s and 80s. Labor's gone, pretty much, as a decisive party in the country. And it appears that the country's moved so far to the right. In any combination of parties you put together to form a government, you can't come up with a left or coalition government that wants peace. That's obviously frustrating to Palestinians. It's very frightening, I think, to the region as a whole, and worrisome here in the United States. Is there the prospect in the offing? What would be the factors that would have to come into play to create a situation where you could move from this right-wing coalition to something different in Israel, or is it out of the question for the foreseeable future?
I'd say, without sounding too pessimistic, that chances are slim. The perception of the idea of peace for Israelis, for many Israelis, has shifted. It's not so much that the electorate has shifted to the right. It's this understanding that the right wing that is devoted to the idea of the settlements in Greater Israel just became stronger, and that's clear. The problem is that the left and the center, or mainly the center, started to adopt this notion that the conflict is impossible to solve, that they'll never see a two-state solution in their life, that basically you have to shift a situation in which you manage the risks, you try to make gestures to the international community, to the Palestinians, but that this idea of solving the conflict and living in peace will never happen. And once you accept this idea, Israelis tend to vote differently. They find centrist parties like Yair Lapid's party, Yesh Atid, to be a great option because it doesn't focus anymore on this divide between pro-peace or anti-peace, or pro-settlements or anti-settlements. It basically says, well, you know, this is something, and Lapid himself says this is something that's not going to be solved. Let's deal with other issues. Let's deal with society, with the economy. Let's just try to manage the situation and keep it in a way that we won't anger the world too much, and we won't lead our country to
So basically it's biding their time, taking more territory, yes, putting more settlers in the West Bank, on the off chance that no one will notice, that almost in the same way, if I could, that between 48 and 67, the conquest of the land inside Israel proper occurred, just kind of a slow and steady process, hoping that no one will notice and there'll be no big disruption.
But this process isn't driven by an ideology that believes that you should expand settlements in the West Bank. There is a portion of the right wing that supports that and advocates that and works on that issue. For the vast majority of Israelis, that isn't the question. The question is, how do we live our life quietly? And frankly, thanks to the security wall and a very effective IDF and Shabak, the Secret Service, basically Israelis are safe now. There's always talk about a third intifada. The third intifada isn't happening, and Israelis feel safe. And this notion that people in Washington and the international community have that the conflict is, the current situation is unsustainable. You can't keep the status quo. For most Israelis, even if they won't admit it, the status quo is very sustainable.
So will it take a major disruption? I mean, do Palestinians have to become so desperate, so angry, so that widespread national violence or something occurs to change this dynamic?
It didn't work in 2000. It actually just hardened the positions of Israelis during the Second Intifada. That didn't work. International pressure didn't work, but we haven't seen yet the major player, the United States, try to apply any pressure. I don't see it happening. Look at the candidates that are running. I don't see anyone really.
This is. I'm sure for Palestinians and for those who care about this issue, it's quite depressing to hear this. But it does correspond to the reality of the situation. I mean, we're moving. Tom Friedman was saying it's a one-state solution. We're there. Right. Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be the prime minister of Israel-Palestine, and we're having an apartheid situation that ultimately people are going to have to look at. That's kind of where we are.
Israelis would call it, I think, a no-solution solution.
Yeah.
One state, two state, three state. They don't see it that way. They just see it as a status quo that is good for them right now.
I would say short-sighted. But nevertheless, it's where we are. The BB tours, serious or not? Comptroller report out that when he was finance minister, he double billed for tours. I mean, if I look at his career, he and his wife over the last 30 years that I've been following the man, the kinds of scandals that he gets into are so freaking banal. I mean, from his wife taking the bottles in the prime minister's house for recycling and taking the money back for her personal expenses. I mean, these are pretty banal. This is not like the major scandals that the governor of Virginia got involved in, Governor McDonald, or Watergate or something. This is petty ante stuff. Why does he keep doing it? And is this going to bring him down? Can this be an issue?
Why does he keep on doing it? I don't know. Maybe he feels powerful enough to do whatever he wants. Just keep in mind that there's a former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who's currently in jail, pretty much for doing the same thing, for double billing, for accepting donations in $100 bills and envelopes. Not much more sophisticated than that. So it could be risky. Currently, based on the information that's out there, it doesn't seem as if there is a strong legal case against Netanyahu that could spell trouble in the sense that Olmert has faced. However, in the public perception, that is a problem, because there is this image that's being established of the royal couple, and Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu, who live in this fancy mansion, who travel at the expense of international donors to the French Riviera and stay at fancy hotels. And that's something that's kind of foreign to the Israeli culture. So in the long run, this could impact Netanyahu, but I don't think that on the criminal level there's anything there.
Thank you so much, Natan. A very depressing but a very real portrait of a political situation that is still evolving, but not in a positive direction. Thank you. That's all the time we've got. For more information, you can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA, and you can check out our website, aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching.